Hey, it's Ed. I want to thank two brand new podcast supporters before we get started. Kristen Dykman and Jen Livesey. Thank you guys so much. Kristen and Jen signed up to be Patreon supporters, which means they support the podcast on a monthly basis. If you go to mountainandprairie.com/support, you can click through to Patreon and see what it's all about, but there are different tiers of support. With each tier comes different rewards, and as you'd expect, all the tiers are themed after Theodore Roosevelt, of course. But I encourage you to go check that out if you're interested. If you're not, no problem. Just keep listening for free. It's free, always will be free. And I really, really appreciate everybody just investing over an hour of their time every other week to listen to this podcast. It really, really means a lot to me. Thank you so much. Hey, this is Ed Robertson, and this is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast, where I introduce you to some of the innovative individuals who are shaping the future of the American West. I meet most of these people through my work in land conservation or through my hobbies and interests that revolve around spending time up high in the mountains. My guests include ranchers, writers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, athletes, artists, adventurers, pretty much anyone who's doing important work, has an interesting story, and loves the American West. My guest today is Bryce Andrews. Bryce is a Montana-based rancher, conservationist, and author whose unique set of experiences gives him uncommon insights into the relationship between humans and carnivores in the West. Having worked as a ranch hand, ranch manager, and ranch owner, Bryce understands agriculture and the myriad of challenges faced by producers. As the field director at the nonprofit People and Carnivores, he's gained firsthand knowledge of the predicaments facing large predators in the Rockies. And as an author, he's researched and written extensively about all sides of the issue, most notably in his books Badluck Way and his new book Down from the Mountain, which was just published earlier this week. Bryce grew up in Seattle, far removed from ranching, farming, and the arid ruggedness of the Rocky Mountain West. But soon after college, he landed an entry-level job at the 20,000-acre Sun Ranch, located in Montana's spectacular Upper Madison River Valley. On the Sun Ranch, Bryce received a trial-by-fire education in the sometimes problematic relationship between agriculture and wild animals, a relationship that he spent much of his professional career exploring. The latest manifestation of this exploration is Down from the Mountain, an educational, entertaining, and sometimes heartbreaking book that explores specific interactions between grizzly bears and farms in Montana's Mission Valley. I was lucky enough to receive an advance copy of this book, and I really cannot recommend it enough. If you're familiar with this podcast and the topics that I love to discuss, then you know that Bryce is the perfect guest. He's smart, funny, insightful, and has a real gift for explaining complex, sometimes controversial topics in an engaging way. We talked a lot about Down from the Mountain, discussing grizzlies, farming, and the unique location and topography of the Mission Valley. We talk about Bryce's upbringing in Seattle and what drove him to explore the West after college. We talk about his work with People and Carnivores and how his background in agriculture helps him to span the divide between his organization and the farming and ranching communities. Bryce also explains his writing and research process and offers some excellent advice for aspiring authors. And as usual, we spend a lot of time discussing books, authors, and his most powerful outdoor experience. I really do encourage you to find a copy of Down from the Mountain and give it a read. You will not be disappointed. So here you go, Bryce Andrews. When you meet somebody for the first time in like a social setting and they ask you that question that people love to ask, what do you do? How do you answer that? Because I know you do a lot of very varied activities.
Well, when I'm asked, what do you do? What do you do for a living? I can never give a simple answer because I am a writer. This is my second book, but I feel like that's incomplete. And I have a life of pieces. My fiance and I have a farm north of Missoula, which we're in the process of starting up. I work as the field director for People and Carnivores, a small nonprofit group that works on large carnivore conflict, and I write. So I try to juggle those three things, and sometimes I get the better of them, and sometimes they get the better of me, it seems like.
Yeah, you do have a lot of balls in there, but they're all super interesting, which is exactly why I wanted to talk with you. Well, I want to obviously talk a lot about your new book, Down from the Mountain, but I think one of the things that to me makes you so interesting and such a cool voice in this world is your background. And so I was thinking maybe we could talk a little bit about your background and then work our way into talking about the book. So you have pretty significant ranching experience, even though you're not a multi-generational rancher. Can you talk a little bit about how you ended up in the ranching world?
Yeah, sure. I definitely started about as far from ranching as a person could get. I was born and raised in Seattle, in the heart of Seattle, and my folks were very involved in Seattle's art scene. My dad was a gallery director, museum director, and my mom, a professional photographer. They're both retired now. So yeah, I grew up far away from that and really had to find my way to agriculture and to Montana. And I did that through my, the Zentz family, and Pat and Susie Zentz are they call themselves my atheist godparents, because they serve the role of godparents without ever, believing in a deity.
Sure.
But, so Pat he's a sculptor and third generation rancher outside of Billings, makes really beautiful, compelling sculptures that translate things like topography and wind into acoustic signatures. And so I grew up going out there and working for them in the summers. And they were kind enough to let me, dither around for a few weeks here and there, and really develop the kind of love for this place and this landscape that have brought me out here and really started me down the path that's been the heart of my professional life, which is ranching in the more wild and remote corners of the state.
Very cool. And so you went to college, followed kind of a normal path of high school, college, and then how long after college did it take you to get to Montana or get to the Rockies? It took
about, I guess it really took about a year. I was like everybody in college, you're immersed in your circumstances. And I stayed on because I had a girlfriend who was a year behind me, and we finally split up. And then I went on sort of a, self-pity tour of riding trains around the country and hitchhiking through Mexico and, doing all these things. And just kind of, I didn't have an idea. So many of my friends seemed to know what exactly they wanted to do. Or failing that, they seemed to know that they needed to be on a path. Mm-hmm. So they were going into med school or law school or any of those. But I knew that wasn't for me. And so I came back from this big exploratory journey and just started casting around. And it was like a 1 in a million thing. I found this job posting on on Montana State University's website. And it was to be a ranch hand on the Sun Ranch in the Upper Madison Valley. And so I applied for it. And fortunately, those experiences and those years of going out in the summertime and working hard for Pat and Susie out in Billings, they were enough. They were just enough to get me hired. And so I kind of really like a person sliding off a cliff. I got like one hand into the agricultural world, got a good handhold, and just hung on like hell because I, got out there to the Sun Ranch and then, basically was just dumped headlong into a world that bore no resemblance to what I had known as a kid growing up or what I had come to understand in college. It was just a place where everything was so immediate, and your contact with wilderness and with specific wild animals, it's so personal and physical, and it was a mind-blowing thing to me.
And so I moved out west I moved to Jackson Hole from North Carolina a few years into my career, and I just hadn't spent much time in the West. And so all of a sudden I went from, North Carolina to Wyoming in October when the weather is changing. And I found there were several occasions, kind of both funny and scary, where I realized, like, holy cow, I'm in over my head here. Whether it was, driving in a snowstorm and not really knowing what to do, or dealing with livestock, just, different, very specific memories when I realized, all right, this is a different world out here. And so do you have any memories from your first few months on the Sun Ranch when you thought, holy cow, this is this is a different world?
Yeah. Well, to come from the Pacific Northwest to the arid Rocky Mountain West, the first thing that you notice is that you begin to shrivel. Like all the moisture you've been bathed in every day of your life from the humid air begins to be sucked out of your body. So, you get there and your lips crack and your hands, start to, dry and flake. And you think, my God, how do people survive here? Are they just withered husks? And then you see some old rancher go by and you go, oh yeah, that is what happens to it. And so, from the get-go, it's hard to miss how different the place is from the coastal, or any kind of more clement, place where a person might have grown up. You see it's arid, it's austere, you can really see the bones of the land. But in terms of specific things that happened, I remember this really well. I was out running, because I go running every day. I was out running after work, maybe a few weeks or a month after I had gotten this job on the Sun Ranch, and I was running across this huge, what we called the North End. So it was just like giant flat expanse that led up to these really steep mountains. And there were always antelope out there, and you would see them and they would see you and they'd go sprinting off to the horizon. Well, I was running along and the sun was setting and I was sort of running, I guess I must have been running north, and I looked off to the east, and I could see this antelope running basically on a trajectory that we were converging. So it was one of those things where I would look ahead and look at my path and look back at the antelope, and the antelope's still coming, and I keep running, and the antelope's still, and we're getting closer and closer and closer.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, it dawned on me that he can't see me. The sun's in his eyes. He doesn't know that it's just the two of us in the midst of this giant, flat, empty plain. And yet we're about to collide head on with each other. And as a kid who grew up in the city, I thought, what the hell do you do about something like that? and so what I settled on is, we were probably like not more than 20 feet away, and this antelope was trotting along and I was running along. I turned to him and I was like, hey, and the antelope skidded to a stop, did sort of a double take, and then ran away faster than I've ever seen an antelope go. And I had this moment where I thought, holy shit, I could, if I hadn't said something, we would have collided. I could have grabbed him, and I realized that I was living in a place where animals, the behavior of wild animals was not a matter of theory. It was not a matter of, speculation. It was my everyday reality. And I think that, truly understanding that and understanding the reciprocal point, which is not just I can do things to animals, but animals can do things to me. That's a huge part of what I've been writing about for the last 10 years and a huge part of the story of Down from the Mountain.
Do you remember your first encounter with a carnivore on that ranch? Because you mentioned a few stories about going out early in the morning when it's still dark. Is there a certain memory of your first kind of, not face-to-face, but close encounter?
Well, I think I'm trying to remember what the actual first one was. I think the first. I'll tell you. This is funny. This is a good example of the weird skills you have to learn if you're a city boy coming to the ranch. I later had all sorts of close, interesting, terrifying encounters, but the very first one was I was riding, packed in a truck cab, with James and Jeremy, the two other guys I worked with, both of whom had spent a lot of time working in that landscape, and they knew a lot of things that I didn't. And they also knew how to see in a way that I couldn't.
Yep.
And we're driving up this road, and Jeremy goes, I'll be damned, that's a wolf. And he's looking out into the sagebrush, And James looks for a second, and a couple, seconds later, he goes, "Oh yeah, there it goes." And I'm looking for I'm just staring as hard as I can, asking them. They're pointing out to me where this thing is, but I couldn't see it. It was, at the time I thought, are these guys messing with me?
Yeah.
Is this okay, got the new guy, let's just mess with him. But that was not the case. I mean, it was that my eyes growing up in Western Washington, growing up in Seattle, they had not been accustomed to focus that way, to look at that, to part that distance and to sort out what is a grayish animal in gray-green sagebrush, and I mean, learning to do that is a process. It's as much a skill of the work that I've done and continue doing as mending a fence.
Yeah, it's cool because it's almost like, how fishing guides can see the fish better than we ever could, and seeing those animals. But in a way, it's almost like trying to get this skill back that we're built to have as a species, because 15,000 years ago, that was every human could do that. And now it's this skill that's been kind of lost because we don't use it. And so I imagine there's probably kind of a primal appreciation you get from developing that skill. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. I mean, the part of what I love so much about the practicing agriculture in the context of the wild areas that remain in the West, is that it brings out it brings out your animal nature. It brings out your essential human animal qualities. It shows you what you can do. It makes you respect what you can't do. It creates feelings for me of satisfaction, but also humility, which I think is important. So
getting that agricultural background, I think is so, in a lot of ways, it's unique in the conservation and environmentalist world. And so then you did, after working on those ranches for a while, you moved over to humans and carnivores, or started doing that in addition to some of your ranching work. So how did that transition take place? When did you decide to head over to that organization and start applying some of your energy that way?
Yeah, well, I've always been, oddly, I've always been a first ranch manager, or ranch hand, then ranch manager, whose actual allegiances lay with the wild things.
Yeah.
That was always my dirty little secret, push came to shove. I mean, I always did my job in terms of protecting my animals, and I did difficult things in the course of doing that. Did violence to wilderness and wild things. But I always felt that affinity, particularly with the big carnivores, because there's such a complicated and difficult history between ranchers, wolves and bears in this part of the world. And after, a decade of managing ranches for other people, of starting my own grass-fed cattle business with a friend in Missoula, so I came to this point where I had sold my half of the business to my friend, and I was living in Missoula, and I realized I had lost that connection that I was just describing to you, that immediate and personal connection with animals. Mm-hmm. And I wanted it back. I needed it back. And that was, I think, what sent me down, put me in a place where I was ready to make that change. Because the work with People and Carnivores, which is a small nonprofit group that specializes on something that I think is really important, which is these very practical, in-the-field projects to reduce conflict between the people living in the West and big carnivores. The idea of being able to do that on different people's ranches, to me, it felt like an extension of agriculture rather than something that was in conflict of it. And it also promised to bring my work more in line with my natural affinities.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. In my experience, and I'm in Colorado now, but I did live up in that area for a while, and it seems that the carnivore issue is, I've always said, other than water rights, I feel like the carnivore issue is one that is sure to just infuriate people on both sides. And so how have you learned to kind of walk that line and have productive conversations and find common ground between two sides that can really find themselves at a stalemate pretty quickly just because of the emotion that's injected into this issue? Have you always been good at that, or has it been a process of learning? Kind of want to know for myself, because I'm always dealing with these high conflict situations in my conservation work. So any advice you have on that, I'd love to hear. Well,
I think it's difficult. I'm still learning how to negotiate those conversations, because they're hard for a good reason, right? Which is that it's very hard to make your living as a farmer or a rancher in the contemporary West. And that has something to do with carnivores, but it also has to do with larger forces like the economics of agriculture in the modern world, and the fact that family farmers and ranchers are competing with massive industrial corporations that are producing food. So, there are a lot of reasons why it's hard to talk about anything that negatively impacts a farmer or a rancher's bottom line. But I consider myself fortunate, because I come to this work out of a decade's worth of working on and then managing ranches. And so I think that's worth something.
Yes.
To the people who are often sitting across the table from me, because not only can I speak their language, but I mean it. I do have, and I will argue this point till I'm blue in the face. I have as much respect for the people making their living from the land as I do for the wild things on it. And I think that, you mentioned the stalemate that we often find ourselves at. I think I don't know how to get past that stalemate all the time, but I do know that one thing always leads to it, and that is failing to respect the needs and the values of the person across the table. Because almost everybody that I'm willing to sit down with wants in their head to be a steward of this landscape. Because whether they make their living from it as a conservationist, or whether they recreate in it, or whether they make their living from it as a rancher, they love this place. And they know that it's important to retain the qualities that make this place so attractive to us, that make us want to live there. And one of those qualities is actually the proximity to wildness. That's the reason why, ranchers who are having a difficult time here, they don't pick up stakes en masse and move to Kansas where there are no wolves. They like being here. And so if you can begin from respecting the person's position, if you can begin from respecting the difficulties in their life, like the fact that, on the shock dairy, which is the subject of Down from the Mountain, or, the place where Down from the Mountain takes place, it's a family dairy. And, you look at the guy running that, and he's been 6 months without a day off. You have to respect that. And you have to know that something that might seem easy to an outsider, right? Like, oh, you've got a corn crop growing and these bears are destroying the corn crop and it is destroying them. Why don't you build a fence around it? Well, where is he going to get that time and that money when he's already in a position where, to make ends meet, he's basically like having to wear out his cows and wear out his land. I think you have to have that kind of true concern and respect for the predicament of the modern rancher and farmer, if you want to talk about these things.
I think that is so well put. And, for me, I understand in theory when you say that, I get it, and I've dealt with enough ranchers and farmers over the years that I get it, but the reality is I've never done that work, and I've never had to get up at 3 a.m. and work, 16, 17 hours manual labor. And so the fact that you have done that, not only do you understand it in theory, but you understand it practically. And I think that shines through. I mean, it definitely does, just in the way you talk about it. Let's talk about the book, because I think this is a perfect transition. I think your experience in agriculture and then your experience on the conservation side of things brought you to this moment where in this interesting valley where this great story unfolded. Can you just give an overview of the book? I'm sure you might be kind of tired of doing that doing that by this point, but yeah, can you just give an overview of the book for people who are not yet familiar with it?
Yeah, I can. Although this is always something I'm really bad at. This is one of those things where when by the time you finish writing a book, you're so deeply mired in it that if somebody asks you to summarize it, you basically just like take some random thread of the story and talk about it incoherently. So I'm going to try not to have that happen here.
Okay. And I'll interject. I'll say that everybody shouldn't worry about summaries. They just need to go buy the book and read it because it's awesome. That's the disclaimer. All right, now you can go.
Thank you. My disclaimer is I'm much better at writing them than summarizing. That's why it takes me 300 pages. No. So here's the thing. The book basically follows two arcs. The first is the arc of the life and death of a single grizzly bear, a bear that biologists named Millie, as she moves out of the mountains and into the settled floor of the Mission Valley on the Flathead Indian Reservation. The book traces, her arc as she becomes attracted to a human-caused source of food, basically a corn crop in the valley floor, and it explores the way that the changes that humans have made to landscape affect the life of this bear, and in the end are her unmaking. I think the parallel line in the story is my own, because I came to the Mission Valley as the field director for People and Carnivores and undertook to protect this cornfield from bears and protect the bears from the cornfield using an experimental electric fence. So this very minimalist design of electric fence that we hoped could keep bears out while allowing other large wildlife to move through freely, and something that we thought could be built for a fraction of the cost of traditional bear fence, which would allow farmers and ranchers to afford to be able to protect these kinds of crops. So the book is about the way the bear's story and my own story collide, and the entanglement that results from that. Because this is where I'll start to just sort of ramble about all the things the book is about, which is, it's about those two stories, but it's also about the way an individual human being and an individual wild animal can become linked, and how their stories can converge against all probability. Because you think about how big this landscape is and how few of us are on it and how rarely we see these things. But once you do converge like that, there's this bond that's formed. So in this case, I learned Millie's story. I saw her. I saw the damage that was done to her because she was actually shot with birdshot in the face. And I became entangled with her story, and then in the story of figuring out, what will we do with these cubs that are orphaned as a result of her wounding and eventual death. And so the story is about the way that colliding with a wild animal, particularly a dangerous animal like a grizzly, the way that changes a human being's story, and how that compels us to act in the future.
You nailed it. See, I think maybe you should give up writing and go on a public speaking tour.
I think I would die of exhaustion. I really do. If you could see me, Ed, right now, I'm leaned over the kitchen table, already leaning on one elbow and sort of like bracing myself up. I don't know why, but these things are always hard for me to get right, and they always tire me out.
You nailed it. I'm telling you, that was perfect. I just read the book. There's zero way I could have ever described it better. So that was awesome. Well, can we talk a little bit about the Mission Valley? Because I love reading about it. I love your description of it. And it's one of the few places in Montana where I have not been. And now it's like at the top of my list that I have to get up there. But I thought, everything from just the physical layout of the valley to its position at the edge of this massive stretch of wilderness. Can you just kind of give an overview of why that valley is so unique?
Yeah, it's unique ecologically, I think, because for me it really blends. In a lot of ways, it blends the place that I grew up in, which is a place farther west and more temperate and more coastal, blends it with the place that I've come to love so much as an adult. I mean, this valley is definitely of the Rockies. I got snowed on this morning.
Nice.
And we've still got, I'm looking out the window here, there's a snowstorm hitting the south end of the Mission Range. Everything a couple hundred feet above us is pure white. But so ecologically, it blends those two things. It's a place where, it feels like the Rockies, and yet occasionally you run into these little like damp groves where there's cedar growing and there are ferns growing, these things that I remember from being a kid. So it has this really sweet blend of the like gorgeous austerity of Montana with something that feels more sweet and more familiar and more fertile to me. So it's interesting ecologically. It's at the south end of a long chain of mountains that stretches northward into Canada through Glacier National Park and the Bob Marshall Wilderness. But it's also unique culturally because this is the Flathead Indian Reservation, and it's the I want to say home, but it's part of the ancestral home, not the whole thing, of the Confederated Salish, Kootenai, and Pend Oreille tribes. So management is different because of that, and the culture here is different because it's a reservation that has a very vibrant and strong tribal culture still, but it has a lot of non-tribal people living on the reservation because of something called the Dawes Act, which was something that went on in the early 20th century, which basically split up common lands that were owned by the tribe and allocated them to individual tribal members who could then sell them out of the tribe or could lose them to outsiders. And also a lot of the tribal land was just declared surplus and sold outright. So there's an injustice that that minimized some of the tribal claims to certain parts of the reservation and transitioned land into the hands of non-tribal people. So there's that history, but there's also a history there of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes making some really, really important and very cool decisions in terms of how to preserve their language and culture and how to preserve the wilderness that persists on this reservation. So the tribes actually declared a grizzly, I believe it's called the Grizzly Management Area in the Mission Mountains tribal wilderness. I believe they were the first tribe to designate a tribal wilderness. And they created these rules where in the tribal wilderness, there's an area where for 3 months out of the year, no human being can go. It's cool. It's to allow, and it specifically was to allow grizzly bears to recover there. And that's the area that's just above this cornfield. And that also shows you the stakes here, because as those bears began to come into this cornfield at the Shock Dairy, they're being pulled out of an area that was set aside just for them so that they could function in a wild area and so that they could function without getting into trouble and getting run over and shot by human beings. So to your point, the valley is unique because it's part of the Salish homeland. And it's also unique because to me, it sits on this dividing line, straddles this dividing line between the Rockies and points farther west.
Yeah, I loved all your descriptions of the valley because it just seems like there's so many different forces at play there that can come together in conflict, and they do on this one cornfield. One thing that I really enjoyed in the book was your description of grizzlies, and I remember the first time I ever saw a grizzly print, I was taken aback by how human it looked. I mean, it almost made my stomach kind of drop when I saw it because it looked so human. Or there was something about it that reminded me of human print. And you have a lot of, throughout the book, it seems like you're comparing and contrasting grizzlies and humans. Can you talk a little bit about that connection or those similarities that you saw between grizzlies and humans?
Yeah, I can. I mean, I've always seen a lot of similarities, particularly between the big carnivores in the West and human beings. And I think that's part of why we have so much trouble with them. like the wolf is a pack hunting social predator that uses similar resources that we want. And like that causes no end of trouble for both species involved. And, the bear, I think the bear embodies a different part of what, there's a different similarity between a bear and a human being in that, the bear is a generalist. A bear is adaptable. A bear uses the landscape in a really creative way. I don't think that word is overstepping in this context, because a bear is moving, at every stage in their year, they're questioning the landscape and finding this really complex path through. Mm-hmm. So, certainly there are physiological similarities. You look at a bear paw print, and you can see your foot in there. You can see your foot with claws, so you can believe that if you feel related when you see one. You see a skinned bear, you see a bear on its hind legs, you pick up a dead bear, and you're aware of how the basic plan is translated from human to Ursan.
Sure.
But then there's also this really phenomenal thing that happens, I believe, with their eyes. There's something about looking at a bear in the eyes in the wild. There's I don't know quite how to describe it. I tried in the book, but there's a connection that exists because of the way a bear looks back and, just like a human does, makes a decision. There's a decision is being made because a bear might run, or a bear might charge, or a bear might just stand there and let you walk by. That agency, that ability to choose, that unquestionable sense of making a decision, I think that's part of what we recognize in bears.
Yeah, that's great. And I've never looked one in the eyes, so I can't speak, but I clearly remember the passage that you're talking about, and it's I look forward to that opportunity sometime, as long as it's somewhat safe on my terms. So one of the things that I really loved about the book was, and it was kind of unexpected to me, a story of being scared of bears out in the middle of the wilderness. That's been written about many times, but you're able to write very clearly and effectively about being scared of these bears, or the tension that comes from being in close proximity to bears. But it's what seemed to me in a very unlikely place, a cornfield. That seems pretty civilized and run of the mill. Everywhere you look, there are cornfields, and here you are having this massive adventure just walking along the edge of a cornfield. So as a writer, how did you approach that? Trying to figure out a way to tell that effectively, because it's kind of a out there concept if you think about it. Not many people would have ever considered that you could be that scared next to what should be a civilized cornfield.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I think that's a very fair question. How did I make a cornfield interesting? That's one way to think about that.
Yeah.
And I write a lot about mundane things, because I've written a lot about fencing.
Sure.
In both in my first book and also in this one, and sometimes I see some humor in that. But sometimes I look at these things. I like the fact that something mundane or something that seems familiar can be revealed as strange and all of a sudden interesting.
Yeah.
And that's the thing about that cornfield, is that once I knew, so I worked alongside that cornfield all summer. First in the building of the fence, which was about 2 miles long, and then in the process of trying to keep bears out as they basically tried every inventive thing you could ever imagine to get in. They, like, one would crawl under, a ditch would go dry, and one of them would find it and crawl under in, like, the 8 hours after the ditch went dry. They were very good at getting in. So once they were in there, the presence of those wild animals, the presence of wildness in that domesticated thicket, which is really what a cornfield is, it totally changed it. And I was so struck by that, to walk along the edge of it and know so many things. There are grizzlies in there. They're not running out and attacking you. So you're essentially being spared. Mm-hmm. That the thing that almost more than anything else stands in for domesticity, which is like a planted cornfield, has been overtaken by wild things. You have all these complicated feelings, and I have those complicated feelings while I'm walking around working on this stuff. And the armature, speaking as a writer, like the armature story that I hang them on, it's the mundane tasks of doing work. Because work has always been how I understand landscape. Mm-hmm. That just has to do with the path that I've taken to get here as a rancher and a writer. And it's the only way I know to look this deeply at things that otherwise might seem simple.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that, obviously your skills as a writer are what bring this whole thing to life and what allow you to tell this story and this very, very unique story about this unique landscape. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about your career as a writer. When did writing become a part of your life, a serious part of your life? Has it always been there?
I think it's always been there to some degree. I mean, I really liked writing, and I like telling stories. I've always liked telling stories a lot, but it became serious on the Sun Ranch. Actually became serious after the thing that forms the pivotal moment in Badluck Way, my first book, which was having to shoot a wolf that was killing cattle. Mm-hmm. I needed to process that somehow. I needed to think about it more seriously than I had thought about anything before. And I don't know whether this is a good thing or a bad thing on the whole, but I've got a pretty bad memory. I need to make notes. I need to commit things to paper if I want to be able to reproduce them accurately. And so in the months that followed that incident with the wolf, in the months of feeling kind of brokenhearted and guilty about it, I lived in this little bunkhouse by myself on the ranch after everybody had left. I stayed on and was sort of the winter guy, and I had all of this time to think and to write, and I found some kind of satisfaction and some kind of closure from something that was really hard for me in that. And I think that's the beginning of me taking it seriously.
Are there any writers that over your life have been important or influential to you? And it could be writers that you know or just writers that you've admired their work from a distance. Anybody that comes to mind there?
Yeah, I mean, I remember being yes, lots of people. I will just name a few. There was something that I really liked about Aldo Leopold's mm-hmm. Sand County Almanac early on. And I think it was the same, that there's a similar combination of work and thought in there, that it's somebody whose professional life is putting them in a relationship. It's putting them in relation to the natural world in a way that they're not quite comfortable with. Yeah. And so I think I was really curious about that because even before I was a rancher, that just intrigued me. I have, there's a book, James Galvin's The Meadow, mm-hmm. that I read that was really important to me. A couple of my friends, David Duncan and Chris Dombrowski, who you just had Chris on, and I would urge you to try to get David to come on the show too.
Oh, I'd love that.
Yeah. But, David's working on this massive, he's somebody who I respected at a distance as a writer before we knew each other, but also somebody like Chris. We were talking about this before the show, but somebody who's really generous with the way they approach other people's work.
Yes.
So, like David's working on this massive masterpiece, huge book called Sun House right now, which is, the last thing I want to do is try to summarize somebody else's book. That's not fair. But I think it's a way, of making sense of a lot of really complicated realities in the West as it exists today. And I find myself drawn to work like that, work that is insightful and also charitable to its characters, because I see there being enough problems in the modern West that I want it all to begin from a position of respect. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. It makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. And a note about David is that his name has come up several times from several different writers as somebody who was at first a positive influence from a distance, and then turned out to be very, very helpful on specific projects they were working with. And he just sounds like such a generous guy. I mean, he's obviously an unbelievably talented writer, but he just on this, little podcast, his name continues to come up as somebody who has mentored all these great writers. And that's refreshing to hear, when you meet a hero and they turn out to even be better than you expected, Right.
We can't let him know of it because it'll go to his head.
Okay. The secret is safe.
Yep. That's where you keep a safe secret, is on a recorded, broadcasted podcast.
Yes. A massive podcast on the internet.
Yes.
Well, he's too busy writing. He's too busy writing this masterwork. He shouldn't be playing around on the internet anyway.
That's right.
So as far as writing goes, is it for you to actually accomplish it? Is it super hard, or have you gotten to a point where it's hard but you enjoy it, or what is your relationship with writing? Because I know for some writers who are even the best of the best of the best, who've been doing it for 50 years, it's still a complete ass whipping when they sit down at the keyboard. And so where do you fall in that? Does it just flow every time you sit down, or is it an ass whipping, or somewhere in the middle?
Oh, yeah, man, I just sit down and it flows
just
every time without exception.
No wonder. It all makes sense now.
No. It's hard. It's a hard thing to do well. Yeah. And you have to be constantly on guard to make sure that you are still doing it well. I really struggle with it when people describe writing as like their curse, their noble curse, because I wouldn't do it if I didn't like it.
Yeah.
I think, if you're bringing your full attention to something like that, and you are, if you believe in yourself enough to think that you can do it in a way that will matter to somebody else, it's really satisfying. It's hard, but it's satisfying. And for me, I just have to make a point of not giving up on it when it feels like I've run out or something like that. You just have to keep, it's like anything. You have to keep working at it even after the point when it's fun.
Oh yeah, definitely. And there was a part in the book, I'm just remembering now, where you're out there and you feel like there are bears nearby, but you talk about this focus that comes over you, and it's not like you're freaking out scared, but you're not relaxed at all. But it's just this, it kind of brings everything into focus. And obviously writing is not hopefully is not a life and death kind of thing on a daily basis. But I feel like if done correctly, it's hard enough that it forces you into this focus that is just hard to get in normal modern day human life. You know what I mean? Yeah,
that's actually a really good point, because it makes me think about the fact that there are very few endeavors or tasks in which I really get into them and then I look up again and hours have passed. Mm-hmm. And the very best days of working on writing are like that. And there were moments at the cornfield with bears in it and being around dangerous animals that require that level of focus. There were moments where time passed that way. And I think maybe that's just what complete presence in a moment feels like. So there's some relation there for sure.
I feel like there are few activities where I can get that. I think writing is one, even though I'm not a good writer, but when I can finally focus in, I think, obviously any being scared or wildlife, but like surfing, I think, can bring it out. Rock climbing can bring it out. Long, really, really, really long running, you can kind of get in a zone. But I feel like that's what it's all about. That's even though and all those are hard things that kind of can kick your ass, but the end result is this flow state, I think, that comes out of it that is just invaluable. It's kind of what I live for, really.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because we make so much use of our conscious mind, but that makes me wonder if animals are living there most of the time or all the time.
I think they probably are. I think most of the time, maybe not all domesticated animals, but wild animals definitely. I would think. Right,
and I mean, it's a funny thing that we're jonesing so hard to get shut of our consciousness. I mean, I think that, that kind of immersion. I mean, I was fascinated with this and wrote about it. The way that proximity to grizzlies like that can sharpen certain parts of your mind. And it can dull others. Mm-hmm. An example of the honing would be, walking along the edge of that stand with every fiber of your being concentrated on whether or not there's movement in there.
Yeah.
But then there can also be this sort of, I mean, if you spend too much time and become too entangled with that situation, there's a hypnotic quality about it that, it's the same way, it's like a little bird looking at a cat coming up on it, where you're sort of, you're drawn toward the danger, just the way, humans are drawn to the edge of cliffs or, drawn to, pitch themselves off of boats at night or, there's that impulse toward the void that I guess is just your brain, trying on scenarios to remind you that it's scary or something. Yeah. But I'm still blown away by how many weird feelings a person feels when they spend a season in and around a cornfield full of grizzly bears.
Oh, I can't imagine it. I mean, I've talked about this with several people on the podcast who do intense work. Like there was a guy who was a smoke jumper and just different, pretty intense lines of work. And whenever I've done something intense, like a multi-week climbing trip or whatever, when I get back, I have such a hard time dealing with normal life. Like all the stuff that is normal, like paying your cell phone bill or emails and stuff, it just drives me insane, and it just seems so pointless and dumb when, a few days before your whole goal was just don't die.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, have you run into that at all? When you've been out, working on a ranch is the real deal, and it requires kind of a shift from normal modern ways of thinking. When you come out of that, is it hard to deal with normal life, or have you figured out techniques for doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely gotten into trouble on occasion because of that weird disconnect.
Yeah.
Because, like if you recalibrate yourself to a life where, on a daily basis, you might be asked to kill an animal or, I don't know, snub a horse off to something if it's acting up, or just all these, you're asked to do these things that are like at once dangerous, sometimes cruel, completely necessary, and where like the standards by which they're judged are completely unsubjective, right?
Yeah.
Either you hit it in the heart or you didn't, there are these sort of like basic qualities that let you know whether you did it right or wrong. Either the cattle got from one pasture to the other, or they're scattered out on the highway. It's one of those two options.
Yeah.
You come back from that, because I've done a lot of kind of weird versions of managing ranches. I've worked for a nonprofit group. I've worked for, I managed a ranch for a nonprofit group. I, managed ranches for a couple of like wealthy absentee people. I've consulted on ranch. I've been in these positions where you have to walk right out of that world and like into a meeting room.
Yeah.
And you have to discuss, you might have to talk about, protocols, or you might have to talk about something that feels so abstract and so unnecessary and so irrelevant to the work that you were just doing that it's really tempting to be impatient in that situation.
Yes.
And to act and to say the childish impulse is that of like, what the hell do you know about it?
Yeah.
And I think I mean, I'm offering that as sort of like a weird, funny personal anecdote, but also I think that's, some of the disconnect, and this goes back to this idea of respecting the actual position of the person across the table. Like in our present political moment and cultural moment, this disconnect exists where, people walk from one world into another and they don't understand the importance of what's being presented to them from something that from a world that's really forward.
Yep.
Because when I walked into that meeting, usually those people weren't just wasting my time. That's how I would have characterized it at the time. But like they were operating, they were doing their best. They were trying in some way. And so I don't know exactly where I'm going with that, except to say that it's caused me difficulty. And I feel like it's not just because I get it and they don't.
I know exactly what you mean because I've been there before. I mean, I remember being gone on some trip, and then a few, maybe 3 days later, I was sitting in a conference room wearing a suit, listening to somebody talk about rental rates for a office building in downtown Washington, D.C. And I was like, what the hell is going – this is the biggest bunch of bullshit.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. That's a much better example. That's exactly what I'm talking about. And,
it's crazy. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Well, so one more question about writing. So obviously there are so many people that would love to have a book published or make a career of writing. And I'm sure you get asked this question all the time, but what is some advice you have for aspiring writers, people that would maybe not even want to do it full time, but just, make writing more a part of their life?
Yeah, I guess I would first ask, are you sure you want that advice from a guy with 3 jobs?
That might be the part of the answer too.
Yeah, maybe it is the answer. I mean, actually if I had to give a serious answer, it would be, and this would be particularly directed at people who want to write nonfiction, like I do. It's that I write best from experience. Mm-hmm. I have to know things very intimately and deeply. And I so far, other people can do this, but so far I cannot write to my satisfaction without living through the story in a way that's very intimate. So for people who want to do this and do it seriously, I guess I would just say try to live a life that strikes you as interesting enough that you would want to write about it.
That's great advice. I think that's great. I mean, there is no substitute for being in the middle of it, having good stories. I mean, otherwise, I don't know how you'd be able to write about it effectively. Even if you were a wonderful writer, if you're writing nonfiction, you got to be in the middle of it. You got to be doing cool stuff. And I don't know, and what I think is cool, somebody else may not think is cool, but it's, I mean, I think you just, that experience is invaluable.
Right. It's either that or you have to do research, God forbid.
Yeah, no thanks on that. I'd rather get chased by grizzly bears.
Yeah. Honestly, I would.
Oh, hell yeah. Then sit in the bottom of a library. Yeah.
But the thing about it is, like, I guess I say that kind of tongue in cheek because you end up having, even if you're writing from life, if you're doing it right, you're going to be researching it and you're going to be looking. You have to follow the strands. You have to follow the strands to their ends if you can. I mean, that's because if you misstep, if you inadvertently write something that doesn't have any truth in it, your work will suffer. It's a fatal flaw.
Sure. Yeah. And speaking of that, I think you do an unbelievably great job in this book of, it's obviously this great personal story, but I mean, you come away from the book with so many hard facts, or I came away with the book, so many hard facts about grizzlies and predators. And there's, it's your story, but it's, throughout is full of all this just super interesting information. And yeah, it is very, very clear that you spent a lot of time researching that. The story is one thing, but those interesting facts, which I just love. I underlined the hell out of that book because there's so many things I need to remember. But I think that's a very good point. So I got some kind of quick questions that I ask people at the end because we're already coming up on an hour, which is crazy. I could definitely keep this going for like 3 more hours. But so
your listeners don't want you to.
I'd beg to differ on that. I think they as we were talking about before we started recording, people were super pumped that you're going to come on. So, but first question, do you have any favorite books? And this is hard, just picking one or two, but favorite books about the American West?
Yes, I do. I do. I'm really going to struggle to name them right now because I when I try to do this, I always get it wrong. I don't know how many. I mean, there are books that are explicitly about the West, and there are books that tell us a lot about the West. Like there's like Paul Shepard's Coming Home to the Pleistocene. Have you ever run across that one?
I've heard of it, but I've never read it.
I read it. I read it as an undergrad.
Oh wow!
And it was in a writing class. But he's a deep thinker about the ways that the human relationship with their natural context. How that kind of grew out of what we are as an animal. I think that tells you a lot about the West. This was supposed to be a short answer. So I would say I'd refer you back to that book, The Meadow.
Yes.
I would say there are a couple I've read recently that I really, Angle of Repose. I would say, Deborah Magpie Erling's book, Perma Red. I read that recently, and I think there's a lot you can learn about the West from that.
Cool.
And yeah, I could go on, but
no, those are great.
I can't do the top 5 thing very well.
It is hard. I mean, it's because I ask people these questions and I don't have any answers to them, so it's kind of unfair.
I could think about it and get back with a better answer.
No, these are great, and for people listening, I'll have links to all these in the episode notes, so you can click through after you buy Bryce's book first. Well, here's a good one. I think you'll probably have a very interesting answer to this. When you think about all of your experiences outdoors in pretty intense landscapes, is there one kind of moment that comes to mind as a very powerful outdoor experience? And that could be scary. It could be funny. It could be interesting. I mean, like that thing where you almost ran into the antelope. That's pretty interesting. But is there one kind of powerful experience that stands out in your mind?
Yeah, this is one I've never really talked about in public before. But a long time ago, a few years ago, I was climbing in the Madison Range, hiking with a friend, and I think it was early spring, so there was still a lot of snowpack.
Yeah. And
we had worked our way up to this ridge, tromping up through these series of really steep ravines and stuff. And we were on top of this ridge walking along, and all of a sudden there was this huge clump, like just thumping noise. And a slab avalanche let go right at our feet, about 3 foot thick slab, and ripped down the mountain, tearing out trees and completely obscuring our trail from coming up.
Wow.
And I think about that sometimes, because I think about how easy and pointless it would have been to die in that way.
Yeah.
That's a very powerful experience that has stuck with me.
Yeah, that's very powerful. I would be thinking about that too. That's wild. So next to the last question, the people that listen to this podcast, they just love the American West in one way or the other, whether that's through conservation, like what you and I do, whether through literature, through athletics, spending time outside, knowing all that you know and all that you've seen, and you're being in the trenches in these conflicts between humans and carnivores and conservation and ranching. Is there, when you think about it, all the wisdom you've accumulated, do you have any words of wisdom to offer to people listening to this, or maybe a request to make of the people listening to this podcast?
I would say have fewer children.
That's a good one.
That's a good start. And I would expand upon that to say that in the West right now, which is a landscape I love dearly and deeply and will for the rest of my life, we're at a very crucial moment in that we have in the next several decades the opportunity to preserve corridors of habitat between our last remaining wilderness areas. We have to do that. We have to do that by every means that we can think of, zoning, shame, whatever it takes. We need to preserve these corridors, these strips, these river corridors and passageways of undeveloped, unfragmented land. And this could be land that's used for ranching and farming. Agriculture goes well with this, but residential development does not. We need to preserve those chunks of land between our last major wilderness areas. And if we don't do it in the next few decades, it's not going to get done. And those places will be gobbled up because we collectively have been very bad at collective restraint so far. And we need, as a culture out here, we need to exhibit collective restraint, preserve those places, and allow animals like grizzlies to thrive into the long future out here.
I think that's a great way to end it, and I agree with everything you said. So how can people connect with you, get the book? Or I think you kind of keep a low profile on social media, which is exactly why you're able to accomplish as much as you do. But how can people connect?
By low profile, you mean I'm incompetent at it. But yeah, here's how people could connect. I would say, the book is available all over. I would love it if people went to a local bookstore and bought that.
Yep.
I think one way that you can support some of the work that's described in that book is to support People and Carnivores. It's a small nonprofit group. There are 4 employees, and we do a lot of good work in this part of the world. So peopleandcarnivores.org is a place where you can go and learn more about that work. But also, I can be found. I do nominally have a Facebook page, but mostly, if you want to get in touch with me, you write to me. My email address is there on the People and Carnivores website. So write me a note.
Well, this was great. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for all you do, first of all, and for your great work writing and your great work in conservation, but for taking the time during I know is a very busy time, but this was really fun. I hope I can meet you in person one of these days.
Well, I hope so too. I'll look you up if I come down to Colorado. Thank you, Ed, for having me. It's been a really good conversation.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast, and thanks for listening to that particular episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Before you go, I've got 3 quick things. Number 1, if you like the podcast, please do me a huge favor. Either pass it along to a friend who may be interested, share it on your social media, or go to iTunes and give it a 5-star review. All those things would mean a lot to me, and they would really help to spread the word about the podcast. Number 2, if you've listened to many of these episodes, you know that I love reading and I love talking about books. Every other month, I send out a quick email with a few books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The subjects are varied, but they're pretty much all nonfiction with an emphasis on history, biographies, adventure narratives, and topics related to the American West. There are no sales pitches for ranches, no spam, no other kind of nonsense, just books. So if you'd like to sign up for the list, head to Mountain and Prairie/reading, or just go to Mountain and Prairie and there's a massive tab at the top that says book recommendations. Click on it. There are a ton of good books that I've read. Some of the old email lists are on there. You can go crazy. There are a lot of books. And finally, if you know anyone I should interview for the podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. All my contact info is at mountainandprairie.com, and I'm on all the social media stuff, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, blah, blah, blah. So feel free to reach out. I'd love to have some recommendations and suggestions of interesting people I should meet. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.